"Security, get him out of here. He's trying to scam the store." The words cut through the polished air of the mall like a blade, sharp enough to turn heads from every direction, sharp enough to freeze the moment in place as if time itself had paused to listen. Marcus Hale didn't move. He stood there in the center of the luxury retail corridor, dressed in a plain black hoodie, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers, nothing about him signaling wealth, nothing about him inviting attention. Yet somehow, all eyes were now locked onto him. The sales associate who had shouted, a tall woman with a tight smile and sharper tone, stood behind the glass counter clutching a folded receipt like it was evidence in a trial no one had agreed to attend. Around them, the mall buzz softened into a low hum, conversations dipping into whispers as shoppers slowed their steps, drawn toward the tension unfolding like a scene they hadn't paid for but couldn't ignore. Marcus's gaze lifted slowly, not in defiance, not in anger, but with a calm that felt out of place against the rising storm, as if he had seen this exact moment before, lived it, memorized it, and chosen deliberately not to react. He glanced briefly at the display case he had been browsing moments earlier, a row of watches gleaming under soft white lights, each one tag with prices that reached well into 5 figures, then back at the employee who had decided, without hesitation, that he didn't belong. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave," she continued, louder now, as if volume alone could turn assumption into fact, her voice carrying past the storefront and into the open corridor where more people had begun to gather. A man in a tailored suit paused mid-step. A young couple stopped beside a pillar, and a teenager lifted his phone just slightly, the instinct to document already kicking in before the full story had even formed. Marcus exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that suggested patience, not submission, and let his hands rest at his sides, his posture relaxed, almost indifferent, but his eyes were taking everything in, every movement, every word, every face that chose to watch instead of question. The store manager emerged from the back office then, alerted by the raised voice, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she approached with authority already written across her expression. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. One look at Marcus, one glance at the associate, and her conclusion was already formed. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, though her tone suggested she had already picked a side. "He's attempting to purchase items without proper verification," the associate replied quickly, her words rehearsed in their certainty, even though Marcus hadn't even reached for his wallet. The manager nodded, turning to Marcus with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir, if you can't provide valid credentials, we can't serve you. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." The phrase landed heavier than it should have, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied, and Marcus felt the familiar echo of something older, something deeper, flicker quietly beneath the surface of his thoughts. For a brief second, the present blurred, replaced by a memory he didn't need to revisit but couldn't ignore. A smaller store, years ago, a younger version of himself being told almost the same words, standing in almost the same silence, realizing for the first time that appearance could outweigh truth in a room full of strangers. The memory faded as quickly as it came, replaced again by the polished floors and bright lights of the present, where the stakes were no longer personal, not entirely. A security guard approached from the far end of the corridor, his pace steady, his presence adding another layer to the unfolding scene, and the subtle shift in the crowd's posture made it clear. This was escalating. Marcus noticed it all, the tightening circle, the quiet judgment, the unspoken assumptions passing between people who had never met him but had already decided who he was. And still, he didn't move. Not because he couldn't, but because he chose not to. Somewhere in the distance, a digital directory screen flickered softly, displaying store names, ownership structures, information most people never care to look at. Marcus's eyes drifted toward it for half a second, just enough to remind himself of something no one else in that moment seemed to understand. He reached into his pocket slowly, not hurried, not defensive, just deliberate, pulling out his phone and unlocking it with a single motion. The manager watched closely, suspicion sharpening her posture, the guard stepping closer, ready. to intervene if necessary, while the crowd leaned in just a little more, drawn by the tension like gravity. Marcus didn't look at any of them as he typed a short message, his expression unchanged, his breathing steady, his presence anchored in a way that made the chaos around him feel almost distant. He pressed send, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and lifted his gaze once more, meeting the manager's eyes with a calm that felt heavier now, more intentional. The mall lights hummed overhead, the air thick with anticipation, and somewhere behind the scenes, something had already begun to move. The security guard stopped just a few feet away from Marcus, his presence firm but uncertain, as if even he could feel that something about this situation did not follow the usual script, and yet the manager's voice cut in again, sharper now, more impatient, insisting on control that was already beginning to slip through her fingers. "Sir, this is your final notice," she said, folding her arms tightly across her chest, the gesture more defensive than authoritative. "You need to leave the store immediately." Marcus turned his head slightly toward her, not fully, just enough to acknowledge that she was speaking, his expression unchanged, his silence stretching the moment in a way that made the air feel heavier than it had any right to be. Around them, the crowd had grown, not dramatically, but enough to shift the energy, enough to create a subtle circle of attention that no one had planned but no one was willing to break. A young employee from a neighboring store stepped closer to the edge of the scene, her eyes narrowing as she studied Marcus's face, as if trying to place something she could not quite name. Two men near the entrance exchanged glances, one whispering something under his breath that neither of them seemed fully confident about. The mall itself continued to function, escalators moving, music playing softly overhead, but within this small pocket of space, everything felt suspended, like the moment before a storm reveals its full weight. The manager stepped forward half a pace, emboldened by the presence of security, her tone now carrying a rehearsed sense of policy. "We have protocols for situations like this," she continued. "If you cannot verify your purchase intent, you cannot remain here." The words sounded official, structured, but they lacked substance, built more on assumption than fact, and Marcus heard it clearly, just as he had heard it years before in rooms that looked different but felt exactly the same. He let his gaze drift past her for a second, scanning the storefront, the employees, the small details most people ignored, the kind of details that told a larger story when you knew how to read them. The employee who had first raised her voice shifted uncomfortably, her confidence beginning to crack under the weight of the attention, though she tried to hide it by adjusting the display in front of her, straightening items that did not need straightening. The guard cleared his throat quietly, a subtle signal that he was waiting for direction. But even he hesitated, his instincts caught between following orders and sensing that something here did not quite add up. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low, steady, and controlled, carrying just enough to reach the manager without needing to rise above the tension. "You said you have protocols," he said, each word measured, deliberate. "Then follow them." The manager blinked, caught off guard not by the content of the statement, but by the calm certainty behind it, as if he were not challenging her, but reminding her of something she should already know. For a brief second, doubt flickered across her face, quickly replaced by irritation. "That is exactly what we are doing," she replied, though her tone had lost some of its earlier sharpness. Marcus held her gaze for a moment longer, then let it fall away, not dismissively, but with a quiet finality that unsettled her more than any argument could have. In the distance, a faint chime echoed from one of the digital kiosks, a routine system notification that no one usually paid attention to, but this time it lingered in the air just a fraction longer, like a note that refused to fade. A nearby store employee glanced at her handheld device, her brow furrowing as she read something on the screen, her posture stiffening slightly before she quickly looked back down, as if unsure whether what she had seen was meant to be shared. Marcus did not react, but he noticed. He noticed everything. The crowd shifted again, whispers growing just loud enough to form fragments of speculation. "Who is he?" someone murmured. "Why is he so calm?" another voice asked. Quietly, the questions hung in the air, unanswered but growing heavier with each passing second. The manager turned slightly toward the guard, lowering her voice, but not enough to keep it from being heard. "Remove him," she said, the command coming out more forcefully than she intended, as if she needed to reassert control before it slipped completely. The guard hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to be noticed, enough to signal that the balance of the situation was already beginning to shift. Marcus remained where he was, unmoved, his posture unchanged, his presence steady in a way that contrasted sharply with the rising unease around him. Another chime sounded, this time from deeper within them all, followed by a faint flicker in the overhead lighting that most people might have dismissed as coincidence, but the employees did not. They knew their systems. They knew that sound. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the certainty that had fueled the confrontation began to erode, replaced by something else, something quieter but far more dangerous: uncertainty. The question did not need to be spoken out loud anymore, because it was already hanging in the air, pressing against every surface, echoing in every glance that shifted from Marcus to the failing systems around them, and back again. The manager felt it most of all, that quiet shift in attention that no longer belonged to her, and she tried to pull it back with sharper movements, with louder words, with the kind of authority that relied on people not questioning it. "This is not related," she said again, her voice rising just enough to cut through the growing murmur, but not enough to restore control. "We are handling a customer issue. Stay focused." But no one was fully focused anymore, not on her, not on the script she was trying to follow. Because now the environment itself was responding, and people trusted what they could see more than what they were being told. A soft voice broke through from the side, hesitant at first, but steady enough to be heard. "Wait, I think I know him." The words did not come from a customer. They came from a junior employee standing near the edge of the storefront, someone who had been quiet until now, someone who had been watching closely, piecing together details that others had dismissed. Her name. Badge caught the light as she stepped forward slightly, her eyes fixed on Marcus with a mixture of recognition and disbelief. The manager turned sharply toward her, irritation flashing across her face. "This is not the time," she snapped, trying to shut it down before it could take shape. But the employee did not step back. "Not this time." "No, I mean it," she continued, her voice gaining strength as the moment demanded it. "I have seen him before. In the ownership briefings. In the internal training modules." The words landed differently than anything else that had been said so far. They were not accusations. They were not commands. They were observations, grounded in something real, something verifiable, and that made them dangerous in a way the manager could not easily dismiss. A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but undeniable, as attention shifted again, this time not just toward Marcus, but toward the possibility that everything they had assumed might be wrong. The guard glanced at Marcus, then at the employee, his expression tightening as the pieces began to rearrange themselves in his mind. The manager forced a short laugh, the kind meant to dissolve tension, but it came out strained. "That is not possible," she said quickly. "You are mistaken." But the employee shook her head, her certainty growing with every second. "No," she said, quieter now, but more confident. "I remember because they emphasized it. Ownership structure. Corporate oversight." They showed his picture. The manager's composure faltered again, just for a moment, but it was enough. Enough for the doubt to spread. Enough for the narrative to crack. Marcus did not interrupt. He did not confirm. He simply stood there, allowing the realization to form on its own, allowing the truth to rise without force. Because forced truth invited resistance, but discovered truth carried weight. Another employee from a neighboring store stepped closer, her handheld device still in her hand, her eyes moving quickly between the screen and Marcus's face. "There's a system alert," she said, her voice tight. "It is tied to executive oversight. Level black." The phrase meant little to the customers, but to the staff, it was unmistakable. It was not a glitch. It was not random. It was intentional. The manager's eyes widened slightly before she caught herself, her posture stiffening as she tried to regain control of a situation that was already slipping beyond her reach. "Stop speculating," she said sharply. Focus on your roles. But her words no longer carried authority. They sounded like denial. The crowd sensed it. The employees felt it. And Marcus simply waited. The lights above flickered once more noticeable this time. A brief dip in brightness that drew a few gasps from the surrounding shoppers, followed by another series of notification tones echoing from deeper within the mall. One by one, storefronts began to react, not closing yet, but pausing, systems locking, transactions halting mid-process. It was not chaos. It was control. Precise. Measured. Deliberate. The kind of response that only came from somewhere above the store level, above the management level, from a place most people in that corridor had never seen, but depended on every day. The manager looked around now, really looked, and for the first time, she saw the pattern, not as coincidence, but as consequence. Her gaze returned to Marcus, and this time, there was no dismissal in it, no assumption, only the growing realization that she had misread the situation from the very beginning. The guard took a small step back, not out of fear, but out of understanding his role in the moment shifting without needing to be reassigned. The employee who had spoken up stood her ground, her earlier hesitation replaced by quiet conviction, as if she had crossed a line she could not uncross, and did not want to. The crowd leaned in closer, not physically, but mentally, every person now invested in what this moment was becoming. Marcus lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting the manager's once more, and in that look, there was no anger, no triumph, just clarity, the kind that arrives when everything unnecessary falls away and only truth remains. And still, he did not speak, because the room was already beginning to speak for him. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was charged, filled with the weight of something inevitable approaching, and Marcus Hale stood at its center like someone who had already seen how it would end. The manager's composure began to fracture in ways she could not fully conceal, her posture stiffening as her eyes moved between Marcus, the employee who had spoken, and the growing signs of disruption rippling through them all. "This is getting out of hand," she said, but the words sounded less like control and more like concern now, her voice no longer carrying the authority it once did. The young employee who had recognized Marcus did not step back this time, her earlier hesitation replaced with something steadier, something rooted in certainty rather than assumption. "You need to check the system logs," she said, her tone careful but firm. "This is not random. It is triggered." The word triggered hung in the air, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to narrow around it. The manager shook her head quickly, almost instinctively, as if rejecting the idea could stop it from becoming real. "No," she said, sharper now. "No one here has that level of access." But even as she spoke, another alert sounded, louder than before, echoing from multiple directions at once, followed by a visible shift in the lighting across several storefronts further down the corridor. Screens dimmed, registers froze, digital displays flickered, and then locked into static interfaces that no longer responded to touch. It was not chaos, it was precision, and that made it worse. A shopper holding a bag from a nearby luxury brand looked down at his receipt as his phone buzzed with a notification, his brow tightening as he read something that made him glance up toward the stores around him. "They just paused transactions," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, but the words carried. Another customer nearby checked her own device, her expression mirroring his confusion. "Same here," she added. The realization spread through the crowd, not in a burst, but in a slow, undeniable wave. This was not isolated. This was systemic. The manager turned fully now, scanning the corridor, seeing what she had tried to ignore before, the synchronized responses, the coordinated halt, the unmistakable pattern forming right in front of her. Her gaze snapped back to Marcus, and this time, there was no dismissal left in it, only the growing awareness that she had misjudged something fundamental. The security guard took another step back, his stance no longer aligned with enforcement, but with observation, as if his role had quietly shifted without anyone needing to say it out loud. Marcus remained still, his presence unchanged, but there was a subtle difference now, not in what he did, but in what the room understood about him. The employee who had first accused him stood behind the counter, her earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by a tight, uncertain posture as she watched the situation unravel in ways she could not control. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then stopped, the words dissolving before they could form. Marcus's gaze moved past them all for a moment, not avoiding the situation, but expanding beyond it, taking in the broader environment, the systems responding exactly as they were designed to, the chain reaction unfolding with quiet efficiency. And in that moment, another memory surfaced, not forced, not dramatic, but clear. A smaller mall. Years ago, a younger version of himself standing near a store entrance, holding a job application that would never be accepted, not because of qualifications, but because of perception. He remembered the way the manager had looked at him then, the same kind of quick judgment, the same dismissal disguised as policy. He remembered walking away without argument, not because he agreed, but because he understood something even then, that power was not proven in the moment you were denied. It was built in what you did after. The memory faded as quickly as it came, replaced again by the present, where the stakes were no longer about access to a store, but about the system that decided who belonged inside it. The manager took a step forward, slower this time, more cautious, her voice lower, stripped of its earlier edge. "Who are you?" she asked, the question no longer rhetorical, no longer dismissive, but genuine, carrying a weight that had not been there before. The crowd leaned in again, the question echoing through their own thoughts, each person now aware that they were witnessing something far beyond a simple misunderstanding. Marcus did not answer immediately. He let the question sit, let it settle into the space that had been created, let it carry its full weight before responding. Because timing mattered, and this moment, this exact moment, was where everything shifted. He looked directly at the manager, his expression calm, his voice steady, and when he spoke, it was not loud, but it did not need to be. "You already know," he said. And in that instant, the final layer of denial began to fall away. The words did not echo. They settled, heavy and irreversible, and for a moment no one moved, not the manager, not the guard, not the employees, who had just begun to understand the weight of what was unfolding around them. "You already know." It was not a threat. It was not even a reveal yet. It was a mirror held up in front of a situation that had been built entirely on assumption, and now that assumption was collapsing under its own weight. The manager's lips parted slightly, but no immediate response came, because somewhere between her certainty and this moment, the foundation had shifted, and she could feel it. The employee who had spoken earlier took a slow step closer, her voice quieter now, but steady, as if confirming something she could no longer ignore. "His name is Marcus Hale," she said, not loudly, but clearly enough for the people closest to hear, and once spoken, the name began to move through the crowd like a current, passed from one whisper to another, gaining recognition with each repetition. The guard straightened slightly, his posture changing not because he had been instructed to, but because understanding had reached him, and with it, a different kind of responsibility. The manager swallowed, her eyes fixed on Marcus now, searching for any sign that could contradict what she was beginning to realize, but there was none. Only calm, only control, only the quiet presence of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. Another alert sounded, sharper than before, followed by a coordinated response across the corridor that no longer resembled a glitch. Storefront displays dimmed in sequence, not randomly, but deliberately, one after another, like a line of lights being switched off from a single command point. The registers inside the store behind the manager froze completely, the screens locking into a message that replaced transaction totals with a simple notification. System access suspended pending compliance review. The employee behind the counter stepped back instinctively, her hands hovering near the register as if unsure whether to touch it or not, her earlier confidence now completely replaced by uncertainty. A voice from deeper in the mall called out, not in panic but in confusion. "Our system just shut down." Another voice responded from across the way, echoing the same realization. Ours too. The pattern was no longer subtle. It was visible. It was undeniable. And it was spreading. The manager turned slowly, taking in the corridor, the stores, the employees now stepping out from behind. Their counters, checking devices, exchanging looks that carried more questions than answers. Her authority, once centered in this small space, now felt insignificant against the scale of what was happening. She looked back at Marcus, and this time, there was no attempt to challenge him, no effort to dismiss him, only the quiet understanding that she had misread not just a person, but an entire situation. Marcus reached into his pocket again, not rushed, not dramatic, simply deliberate, and pulled out his phone. He glanced at the screen briefly, reading something only he could see, then lifted his gaze back to the manager. "You asked who I am," he said, his voice even, carrying just enough to cut through the surrounding noise without rising above it. "I'm the one who signs off on every operational standard in this building." The words did not land all at once. They settled, piece by piece, as the meaning caught up with the sound. The employee who had recognized him lowered her gaze slightly, not out of fear, but out of respect, as if the confirmation had aligned everything she had sensed but could not fully prove. The guard took another step back, creating space not because he was told to, but because the situation no longer required his presence in the same way. The manager's shoulders dropped just slightly, the tension that had held her posture rigid beginning to release as reality replaced assumption. "You are," she started, but the sentence did not finish because it did not need to. Marcus did not nod. He did not confirm with a gesture. He simply let the moment exist, let the environment continue to respond, let the system speak in ways that required no further explanation. Another sequence of lights dimmed further down the corridor, followed by the soft but unmistakable sound of storefront gates beginning to lower in sections of the mall, not yet visible from where they stood. Not slammed shut, not forced, just controlled closure, executed with the same precision as everything else. The crowd reacted with a low murmur, not of panic, but of realization, as the scale of what was happening became clear. This was not about one store. This was not about one interaction. This was about a system responding to a breach, a pattern, a failure that had just been exposed in real time. Marcus looked around. Once more, taking in the people, the space, the quiet shift in understanding that had replaced the earlier tension. And then he looked back at the manager, his expression unchanged, his voice steady, and said, "This is what happens when policy is used without judgment." The words did not accuse. They clarified. And in that clarification, the room finally understood what it had been witnessing all along. The realization did not explode. It settled, deep and irreversible, like something that had always been true but had only now been seen, and the entire corridor seemed to hold its breath as Marcus Hale stood unmoved while the system continued to respond around him with quiet precision. The manager's eyes did not leave his face now, not out of defiance, but out of a need to understand how a moment that had started with certainty had turned into something she could no longer control. The store behind her was no longer functioning in any meaningful way. The registers locked, the displays dimmed, the environment itself stripped of the illusion of normal operation. And beyond it, further down the mall, more storefront gates were lowering in controlled intervals, each one a visible confirmation that what was happening here was no longer isolated. A customer near the entrance turned slowly, watching one of the distant gates descend halfway before stopping, his voice low but clear enough to carry. "They're shutting everything down." Another shopper checked her phone again, scrolling through a notification that had just appeared, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to disbelief. "It says compliance shut down across multiple stores," she murmured. The words spread quickly, not through panic, but through recognition, each person beginning to piece together the scale of what they were witnessing. The guard stood to the side now, no longer part of the confrontation, his earlier role replaced by quiet observation, his posture reflecting a change that did not require permission. The employee who had first spoken up remained still, her earlier uncertainty replaced with a steady awareness that she had just witnessed something most people would never see up close. The manager inhaled slowly, as if preparing to speak, but when she did, her voice was no longer sharp, no longer commanding, only measured, almost careful. "This cannot be happening because of one interaction," she said, though it sounded less like a challenge and more like an attempt to understand. Marcus tilted his head slightly, not dismissing the statement, but acknowledging the logic behind it, and when he responded, his tone remained even, grounded, and clear. "It is not because of one interaction," he said. "It is because this interaction revealed a pattern." The words did not accuse. They explained. And in that explanation, the room shifted again because now the focus was no longer on a single moment, but on something larger, something systemic, something that extended beyond this store, beyond this corridor, beyond what anyone here had initially believed. The manager's shoulders lowered just slightly, the tension giving way to understanding that arrived too late to change what had already been set in motion. "A pattern," she repeated quietly, as if testing the word against everything she had seen and everything she had ignored. Marcus did not elaborate immediately. He allowed the systems to continue speaking, the environment itself becoming the explanation. Another series of notifications echoed through the mall, followed by a synchronized dimming of lights across an entire section, not dark, but reduced, as if signaling a controlled pause rather than a failure. Employees from other stores stepped into the corridor now, holding devices, exchanging information, their faces reflecting the same realization spreading from one end of the space to the other. This was not random. This was deliberate, and it had been triggered. Marcus looked at the manager again, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged, and then he spoke, not louder, but with a clarity that carried through the noise without needing to rise above it. "You denied service based on what you assumed I was," he said. "You escalated without verification. You called security without cause. And you did it in a system that is monitored for exactly that pattern." Each sentence landed with precision, not rushed, not emotional, just factual, each one aligning with what the employees around them were now seeing reflected in their systems. The manager's eyes lowered briefly, not in shame alone, but in recognition, the kind that comes when the gap between intention and impact becomes impossible to ignore. "I thought I was following protocol," she said, her voice quieter now. Marcus nodded once, a small acknowledgement that did not absolve, but did not attack either. "Protocol without judgment becomes bias," he replied. The statement hung in the air, heavier than anything that had been said before because it did not just apply to this moment, it applied to everything that had led to it. The crowd was no longer whispering. They were listening, fully, intently, because what they were witnessing was no longer just a confrontation. It was a correction, a system responding to itself in real time. The employee behind the counter stepped back further, her earlier certainty gone completely, replaced by a stillness that mirrored Marcus's, but for entirely different reasons. The guard shifted his stance again, now positioned slightly behind the manager rather than beside her, a subtle but clear indication of where the balance of authority had moved. And then, without raising his voice, without changing his posture, Marcus delivered the moment that would define everything that followed. "You did not deny service to a customer," he said. "You denied service to the person who determines whether this store stays open." The words did not echo. They settled, and as they did, another gate further down the corridor completed its descent with a soft, final sound, marking the exact moment the truth fully arrived. The final words did not need to be repeated because the room had already absorbed them, fully, completely, and irreversibly, and what followed was not an explosion of reaction, but a collapse, quiet and undeniable, as the system continued to execute its response with a precision that left no room for doubt. The store behind the manager emitted a low, steady tone, followed by the complete shutdown of its primary systems, the screens fading to black one by one, the soft glow disappearing as if the store itself had been switched off from somewhere far beyond its walls. The overhead lighting dimmed slightly, not enough to darken the space, but enough to signal a transition, a shift from operation to suspension, and the effect rippled outward, storefront after storefront entering the same controlled state, their gates lowering in measured intervals, each movement smooth, deliberate, and final. The manager did not move at first, her body still, but her expression changing in ways that could not be hidden anymore. The realization settling deeper with each passing second as the environment confirmed what Marcus had already made clear. Around them, employees stepped out into the corridor, some holding tablets that no longer responded, others simply standing in place, watching as their stores, their workspaces, their sense of normalcy shifted into something unfamiliar. A voice from across the corridor called out again, this time louder, carrying the weight of confirmation. "We are locked out. Full system suspension." Another voice followed from a different direction, echoing the same message. "Same here. Everything is down." The crowd reacted in a low wave of sound, not panic but recognition, a shared understanding that they were witnessing something larger than any individual interaction, something systemic and intentional. The guard remained still, positioned slightly behind the manager, his earlier authority now replaced by quiet awareness, his role no longer to act, but to observe. The employee who had first spoken stood near the edge of the store, her eyes moving between Marcus and the unfolding shutdown, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a kind of clarity that came from seeing the truth play out in real time. The manager finally exhaled, a slow release of breath that seemed to carry the weight of everything she had misjudged, everything she had assumed, everything that had led to this exact moment. She took a small step forward, not with authority, but with something closer to humility, her voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. "I did not know," she said, the words simple but heavy, not offered as an excuse, but as an acknowledgement. Marcus met her gaze, his expression unchanged, not cold, not forgiving, simply steady, as if he had heard those words before in different forms, in different places, across different moments in time. "That is the point," he replied, his tone even measured. "You did not know, but you acted anyway." The statement did not accuse, it clarified, and in that clarity, the situation settled into something undeniable. The manager's eyes lowered briefly, not in defeat alone, but in understanding, the kind that arrives when there is no longer anything left to defend. Behind her, the final display screen in the store flickered once, then went completely dark, leaving only the reflection of the people standing in front of it, their expressions visible in the glass where products had once been showcased. The symbolism was not lost on anyone watching. The system had not reacted out of anger. It had responded out of design. Marcus shifted his weight slightly for the first time, a small movement that drew attention not because of its size, but because of its timing, as if marking the transition from reaction to resolution. He looked past the manager, down the corridor where more gates had now fully closed, the once vibrant stretch of stores now quiet, paused, waiting. And then he looked back at her, his voice calm, carrying the finality of what had already been decided. "This is not punishment," he said. "This is accountability." The words settled into the space with a different kind of weight, not sharp, not forceful, but absolute, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The manager nodded slowly, not because she was told to, but because she understood, because the system around her had made it impossible not to. The employees nearby remained silent, their earlier roles replaced by observation, their understanding shifting alongside the reality unfolding in front of them. The crowd began to disperse slightly, not out of disinterest, but because the moment had reached its conclusion, the truth no longer hidden, the outcome already set in motion. And in the center of it all, Marcus Hale stood exactly as he had from the beginning, calm, composed, unchanged as the world around him adjusted to the standard he had quietly enforced. The mall did not return to normal immediately, and that was the point, because some things are not meant to reset as if nothing happened. Some moments are meant to leave a mark, quiet but permanent, and Marcus Hale stood in the center of that stillness as the last storefront gate in the visible corridor settled into place with a soft, final click that echoed just enough to be remembered. The lights remained dimmed, not dark, but subdued, as if the entire space had taken a step back to reflect on itself. And the absence of movement where there had once been constant activity made every sound clearer, every breath more noticeable, every glance more intentional. The manager remained where she was, her posture no longer rigid, her expression no longer defensive, but something else now, something quieter, more aware, as if the weight of what had happened was still settling into her understanding in layers she could not rush through. Around her, employees stood in small clusters, their voices low, their conversations no longer about transactions or inventory, but about what they had just witnessed, about the system they worked within and the assumptions they had carried into it without question. The guard looked toward Marcus once more, not as a subject to be handled, but as someone whose presence had revealed something larger than any one role could contain. And with that look came a subtle shift, a respect that did not need to be spoken to be understood. Marcus glanced down the corridor one last time, taking in the closed gates, the paused systems, the quiet recalibration of an entire environment, and there was no satisfaction in his expression, no sense of victory, only a calm acceptance that this was what accountability looked like when it was allowed to happen in real time. A few customers lingered at a distance, their earlier curiosity now replaced with something deeper, something reflective, as if they were replaying the moment in their minds, recognizing parts of it they had seen before in different places, different contexts, different lives. One man shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in recognition, as if he had just watched something he had always known existed, but had never seen addressed so directly. A woman nearby folded her arms, her gaze steady, her expression thoughtful, as if considering how easily the situation could have gone unnoticed, how often it probably had. Marcus turned his attention back to the manager, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear, not through raised voices or forceful action, but through the quiet unfolding of consequence. When he finally spoke, his voice was as steady as it had been from the beginning, carrying a weight that came not from volume, but from truth. "This does not end here," he said, not as a warning, but as a statement of process. "Every store will be reviewed. Every report will be examined, not to assign blame, but to correct what has been allowed to continue." The manager nodded slowly, not out of obligation, but because she understood that this moment was not isolated, that it was part of something larger that would move forward whether she resisted it or not. "I understand," she replied quietly, and for the first time, her words carried no defense, only acknowledgement. Marcus held her gaze for a brief second longer, then shifted slightly, turning his body just enough to signal that his role in this moment was complete, that what needed to be set in motion had already begun. As he stepped away, his movement was not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate, the same controlled presence that had defined him from the moment he arrived. The crowd parted subtly, not out of instruction, but out of instinct, creating space for him without needing to be told, each person aware, in their own way, that they had just witnessed something that extended beyond a single interaction. The mall remained quiet behind him, the system still paused, the environment still in transition, and yet there was a sense that something had shifted permanently, something that would not simply revert once the lights returned to full brightness and the gates lifted again. Because the change was not in the space itself. It was in the awareness of the people within it. As Marcus walked toward the exit, the reflection of the dimmed lights followed him across the polished floor, and for a brief moment, he paused, not to look back, but to let the silence settle fully into place, to let the lesson exist without interruption. Then, without turning, he spoke one final time, his voice calm, measured, and clear enough to carry just far enough to be heard by those who needed to hear it. "I did not raise my voice," he said. "I raised the standard." And with that, he continued forward, leaving behind a space that would not forget what had just happened, not because it was loud, but because it was true.